The first shot shattered the silence of the warm June evening, a sound so unexpected that Pearl Anderson nearly dropped the pot of stew she was struggling to salvage. The second shot sent her to her knees, her shaking hands instinctively covering her head as memories of her husband's rage flooded back. In the 14 months since she'd fled Tennessee, Pearl had learned that some scars weren't visible to the eye, but tonight, huddled on the floor of her small kitchen in the Wyoming Territory of 1878, she wondered if she'd ever truly escape. Pearl's heart hammered against her ribs as the sound of hoofbeats approached the small homestead she'd been hired to tend. Gathering her courage, she peered through the window to see a man slumped over his horse, one hand pressed to his side where a dark stain spread across his dusty shirt. Despite her fear, Pearl couldn't ignore someone in need. She'd spent too many years being ignored herself. Wiping her hands on her apron, she cautiously opened the door and stepped onto the porch, squinting into the fading light. "Mister, you need help." The stranger raised his head, revealing a face bronzed by the sun and framed by dark blonde hair. His eyes, pain-filled but alert, found hers. "Madam," he managed, his voice strained, "seems I've gotten myself into a spot of trouble." He attempted to dismount but swayed dangerously, nearly falling. Pearl rushed forward, her own troubles momentarily forgotten. "Easy now," she said, reaching his side just as his knees buckled. Despite her slight frame, years of hard work had made her stronger than she looked, and she managed to brace him enough to keep him from collapsing entirely. "Name's Adam Lawson," he said through gritted teeth. "Sorry to trouble you, but I don't think I'll make it to town." "Pearl Anderson," she replied automatically, helping him toward the house. "And it's no trouble. I'm alone here anyway." The words slipped out before she could think better of them, and she immediately regretted revealing so much to a stranger. Adam seemed to sense her unease. "I'm not running from the law, if that's your worry. Just some men who think I cheated them at cards." He winced as they navigated the porch steps. "I didn't, for the record." Pearl helped him to the kitchen table, noticing how he scanned the room with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to assessing threats. "I'll need to see that wound," she said, gathering clean cloths and heating water. "You've done this before?" Adam asked, attempting to unbutton his shirt with fingers that wouldn't quite cooperate. Pearl gently moved his hands aside and took over the task. "My father was a doctor back east. I helped him sometimes." She didn't mention that her education had ended when she married Harold at 17, her dreams of following in her father's footsteps abandoned for a life that had quickly turned into a nightmare. As she peeled back the blood-soaked fabric, Pearl was relieved to see that the bullet had only grazed his side, leaving a nasty furrow but nothing life-threatening. "You're lucky," she said, cleaning the wound with steady hands. "An inch to the left and we'd be having a different conversation." Adam watched her work, his initial wariness giving way to something like respect. "Seems luck's been in short supply lately, but I'll take what I can get," he hissed as she applied a poultice. "You live here alone?" The question made Pearl stiffen. "I work for the Millers. They're in Cheyenne for 2 weeks, visiting their daughter who's expecting." She kept her eyes on her task, not wanting to see any judgment in his. "I keep house, cook, tend the garden." Adam nodded, seeming to understand her need for brevity. "Good people, the Millers?" The question hung in the air, loaded with meaning that Pearl understood all too well. "Yes," she said simply. "Good people." They fell into silence as Pearl finished bandaging his wound. When she was done, Adam caught her wrist gently, his touch so unlike Harold's that she didn't immediately pull away. "Thank you," he said, his eyes holding hers. Not everyone would help a stranger bleeding on their doorstep. Pearl withdrew her hand, uncomfortable with the gratitude. "Are you hungry? I've got stew, though it's a bit." She glanced at the pot on the stove, remembering how she'd been trying to save it before the gunshots. Adam's smile was surprisingly warm. I'd be grateful for anything that isn't trail rations. Pearl ladled the stew into bowls, all too aware of her guest's eyes on her as she moved around the kitchen. The familiar anxiety began to build in her chest. Would he find fault with her cooking? Would his gratitude turn to anger if the meal didn't meet his expectations? She set the bowl before him with a hand that trembled slightly, then turned away quickly, busying herself with tidying up rather than sitting to eat her own portion. "Aren't you joining me?" Adam asked, his spoon poised above his bowl. "I should clean up first," Pearl said automatically, the words a reflexive response born of years of conditioning. Adam's brow furrowed. "The food will get cold." He gestured to the chair across from him. "Please sit. I don't like eating alone." Reluctantly, Pearl took the seat, her own bowl untouched before her as she watched Adam take his first bite. She held her breath, waiting for the criticism, the flash of disappointment or worse, the surge of rage that had so often followed Harold's first taste of her cooking. Instead, Adam closed his eyes briefly, a sigh of contentment escaping him. "This is good," he said, taking another spoonful. "Really good." Pearl blinked in surprise. It's burnt on the bottom. I got distracted when I heard the shots." Adam shrugged, continuing to eat with evident enjoyment. "Can't taste that at all. Besides, I've eaten far worse. Once spent 2 weeks with nothing but jerky and beans that had started to sprout." The casual acceptance in his voice loosened something in Pearl's chest, allowing her to take a bite of her own stew. He was right, it wasn't as ruined as she'd feared. As they ate, Adam told her about his life as a former cavalryman turned ranch hand and occasional gambler. He'd been heading north to Montana, where an old army friend had offered him work, when the card game in Laramie had gone sideways. "They'll give up the chase soon enough," he assured her. "I didn't take much, and they weren't exactly upstanding citizens themselves." "You can stay the night," Pearl offered, surprising herself. "In the barn, I mean. It wouldn't be proper otherwise, and if the Millers heard." Adam nodded, understanding. "The barn will be fine. I appreciate it." After dinner, Pearl showed him to the barn, providing blankets and fresh water. When she returned to the house, she found herself standing in the kitchen, staring at the dishes from their meal. For the first time in months, she'd shared a table with a man and hadn't been afraid. The realization brought tears to her eyes, which she quickly wiped away. She was just finishing the dishes when a noise at the door made her freeze. It wasn't Adam's measured knock, but a heavy pounding that sent a chill down her spine. "Open up," a gruff voice demanded. "We know you've got him in there." Pearl's hands tightened on the dish towel. The men Adam had mentioned they'd tracked him here. Her mind raced, calculating her options. She could deny everything, but if they searched and found Adam in the barn, they might think she'd been deliberately harboring him. Or she could tell the truth and potentially send a wounded man to his death. The pounding came again, more insistent. "Last chance before we start getting unfriendly." Taking a deep breath, Pearl moved to the door, cracking it open just enough to peer out. 3 men stood on the porch, their faces hard in the lantern light. "Evening, gentlemen," she said, keeping her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Can I help you?" The tallest of the 3, a broad-shouldered man with a scar cutting through his left eyebrow, stepped forward. "We're looking for a card cheat. Blonde fellow, probably wounded. Saw tracks leading this way." Pearl lifted her chin slightly. "I haven't seen anyone like that." The man's eyes narrowed. "Mind if we look around? Just to be sure." "I do mind," Pearl said firmly. "This isn't my property, and the owners wouldn't appreciate strangers poking about." "The owner's here now?" the second man asked, a thin smile spreading across his face. "No, but..." Then I reckon they won't know if we have a little look-see, Scar said, pushing against the door. Pearl braced herself, ready to stand her ground, when a voice from behind the men cut through the tension. Evening, boys. Seems like the ladies made herself clear. Adam stood in the yard, his gun held casually at his side. Though his face was pale from blood loss, there was a dangerous steadiness to his stance that made the men turn slowly, hands hovering near their weapons. Lawson, Scar growled, you've got something that belongs to us. Can't steal what was rightfully won, Adam replied evenly. Now I suggest you mount up and ride out. This lady's got nothing to do with our disagreement. The standoff stretched for several heartbeats, the air crackling with tension. Pearl held her breath, one hand clutched around the door handle, the other hidden in the folds of her skirt where she'd tucked a kitchen knife. Finally, Scar spat on the ground. This ain't over, Lawson. Never thought it was, Adam replied. But it won't be finished here. The men backed toward their horses, keeping their eyes on Adam. Once mounted, they lingered just long enough to make clear their reluctance to leave before riding off into the darkness. When the sound of hoofbeats faded, Pearl released a shaky breath. You shouldn't have come out, she said, stepping onto the porch. You're wound. We'll heal, Adam finished, holstering his gun with a wince. Couldn't let them bother you on my account. Pearl wanted to protest, to point out the foolishness of risking his life when he could barely stand, but the words caught in her throat when she saw the genuine concern in his eyes. Come back inside, she said instead. I should check your bandage. Make sure you haven't started bleeding again. Adam followed her into the kitchen, where Pearl gestured for him to sit while she gathered her supplies. I thought I told you to stay in the barn, she said, unwrapping the bandage to inspect the wound. You did, Adam agreed, his expression sheepish. But I heard their horses and figured they might be trouble. Seemed wrong to leave you to face them alone. Pearl paused, her fingers gentle against his skin. I'm used to facing things alone. Adam's eyes met hers, steady and serious. That doesn't make it right. Something in his tone made Pearl look away, uncomfortable with the understanding she saw in his gaze. The wound looks clean, she said, applying fresh salve. But you've strained it. You should rest. I'll head back to the barn once we're sure they're gone for good, Adam said, though he made no move to rise when she'd finished rebandaging him. Pearl busied herself putting away her supplies. I'll make up a pallet here by the stove, she said finally. Just for tonight. It's warmer, and I can keep an eye on you. Adam's smile was gentle. Thank you, Pearl. For a moment, neither spoke, the quiet kitchen filled with something Pearl couldn't quite name, not quite comfort, but not the fear she'd grown so accustomed to either. Who was he? Adam asked softly. Pearl stiffened. I don't know what you mean. The man who taught you to be afraid of getting dinner wrong. Pearl turned away, her hands gripping the edge of the sink. You don't know what you're talking about. I've seen it before, Adam said, his voice still quiet. The way you watch for reactions, how you apologize for things that aren't your fault. How you flinch sometimes when I move too quickly. Tears burned behind Pearl's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. It doesn't matter now. He's back in Tennessee, and I'm here. It matters, Adam said simply. Pearl stood motionless, feeling exposed in a way that had nothing to do with physical nakedness. Finally, she turned to face him. My husband, she admitted, the words like stones in her mouth. Ex-husband now, I suppose, though the divorce isn't final yet. Adam nodded, not pushing for more, just waiting with a patience that Pearl found strangely comforting. I burned supper the night I left, she continued, the memory rising unbidden. It wasn't the first time he'd hit me, not even the 100th, but something was different that night. Maybe it was the way he smiled while he did it, Or maybe I just finally had enough. When he fell asleep, I took what little money I'd managed to hide away and walked to the train station. Been moving west ever since. How'd you end up here? Adam asked. Pearl gave a small shrug. Saw an advertisement in a newspaper. The Millers needed help, and they didn't ask too many questions when I showed up with nothing but a carpetbag and bruises I couldn't quite hide. Adam's jaw tightened, but his voice remained gentle. He can't find you here? I don't think so, Pearl said, though the fear had never truly left her. Wyoming's a long way from Tennessee, and I've been careful not to write to anyone who might tell him where I am. Adam nodded slowly. Well, if he ever does come looking, he'll have me to deal with. The declaration hung in the air between them, both knowing it was unlikely Adam would still be around if Harold ever tracked her down. Yet Pearl found herself warmed by the sentiment nonetheless. I should make up that pallet for you, she said, moving toward the small closet where extra bedding was stored. That night, Pearl lay awake in her narrow bed, listening to Adam's steady breathing from the kitchen. The familiar knot of anxiety in her chest had loosened somehow, replaced by something unfamiliar, not quite hope, but perhaps its distant cousin. She woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of movement in the kitchen. For a moment, disorientation gripped her. The Millers weren't due back for days, and she lived alone before the events of the previous evening rushed back. Adam. Hastily dressing, Pearl made her way to the kitchen to find Adam at the stove, awkwardly attempting to cook eggs with one hand while favoring his injured side. What are you doing? She asked, more confused than alarmed. Adam turned, a slightly abashed smile crossing his features. Making breakfast, or trying to. Thought you might like a morning off from cooking. He gestured to the table where he'd set out plates and cups. Coffee's ready at least. Pearl stood frozen, trying to process the sight before her. In her experience, men didn't cook for women. They certainly didn't cook for their wives or housekeepers. You don't have to do that, she said finally, moving to take the spatula from him. Adam held it out of reach. I know I don't have to. I want to. His expression grew more serious. I've been taking care of myself a long time, Pearl. Figure it's only fair I do my part while I'm here. Reluctantly, Pearl settled at the table, watching as Adam finished cooking the eggs and brought them to the table along with a plate of slightly burnt toast. It's not much, he said, sitting across from her. And the toast got away from me a bit. Pearl took a bite, surprised to find the eggs perfectly cooked despite his obvious difficulty in preparing them. It's good, she said honestly. Adam's smile was warm enough to chase away the last of the previous night's chill. High praise from someone who makes stew like yours. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes before Adam spoke again. I should move on today. Those men might come back, and I don't want to bring trouble to your door. Pearl nodded, trying to ignore the pang of disappointment the words provoked. Your horse could use another day of rest, and so could you. That wound needs time to heal. Are you offering to let me stay? Adam asked, his eyes twinkling with gentle humor. Just until you're well enough to travel safely, Pearl clarified, though she couldn't help returning his smile. I'd hate for all my doctoring to go to waste if you collapse on the trail. Adam laughed, then winced, pressing a hand to his side. Fair enough. One more day, then. That day stretched into 2, then 3, as Adam's wound slowly healed. During the daylight hours, he insisted on making himself useful despite Pearl's protests, fixing a loose board on the porch and reinforcing the chicken coop against predators. In the evenings, they sat together at the kitchen table, Adam teaching Pearl to play poker with a worn deck of cards he carried in his saddlebag. You've got a natural poker face, he told her after she'd won her 3rd hand in a row. Must be all that practice keeping your thoughts to yourself. Pearl gathered the cards, her fingers brushing against his as she handed them back. Never had much choice in that. Adam's hand covered hers briefly. You've always got choices now, Pearl. Remember that. On the fourth morning, Pearl woke to find Adam already outside, tending to his horse. The sight of him preparing to leave sent an unexpected pang through her chest, though she'd known all along that this arrangement was temporary. Planning to sneak away without saying goodbye? She asked, stepping into the stable. Adam looked up, his expression softening when he saw her. Never, he said. Just getting things ready. Figured I'd head out after breakfast. Pearl nodded, twisting her apron between her fingers. I made flapjacks, she said. Thought you might like something substantial for the road. Adam's smile reached his eyes, crinkling the corners in a way that made Pearl's heart beat a little faster. I'd like that very much. Over breakfast, they spoke of practical matters, the supplies Adam would need, the route he planned to take to Montana. Neither mentioned the oddly domestic rhythm they'd fallen into over the past few days, nor the reluctance they both clearly felt about its ending. I want to thank you, Adam said finally, as Pearl packed the remaining flapjacks for him to take along. Not just for patching me up, but for... He paused, seeming to search for the right words. For reminding me what it's like to have a place to come back to at the end of the day. Pearl kept her eyes on her task, afraid of what he might see in them. You've been good company, she admitted. It's been nice not to be alone. Adam rose from the table, moving to stand beside her. Pearl, he said quietly, waiting until she looked up at him. I'd like to write to you, if that's all right, and maybe, when I'm settled in Montana, I could come back this way. The question in his eyes made Pearl's breath catch. I'd like that, she whispered. Adam's hand came up slowly, giving her plenty of time to pull away, before gently touching her cheek. You'll never have to be afraid again, he said, his voice low and fervent. Not of me, not of burning supper, not of anything. I promise you that. Pearl closed her eyes briefly, leaning into his touch. Don't make promises you can't keep, she said softly. I never do, Adam replied, and then he was bending toward her, his lips meeting hers in a kiss so gentle it brought tears to her eyes. When he pulled away, Pearl found herself reaching for him, her hand resting against his chest where she could feel his heart beating strong and steady beneath her palm. I have to go, he said reluctantly. Pearl nodded, stepping back. I know. Adam collected his things, and Pearl walked with him to where his horse waited, already saddled. He mounted carefully, his sides still tender, then looked down at her with an expression that made her feel both seen and cherished. I'll write as soon as I reach Bozeman, he promised. Pearl shaded her eyes against the morning sun. I'll be here. She watched him ride away, standing in the yard long after he disappeared from sight, the memory of his kiss still warm on her lips. The Millers returned 2 days later, full of stories about their new granddaughter and grateful for Pearl's care of their home. Life settled back into its familiar routine, cooking, cleaning, tending the garden, but Pearl found herself watching the road more often, hoping for a glimpse of a rider or the arrival of a letter. Weeks passed with no word, and Pearl tried not to let disappointment consume her. Adam owed her nothing, after all. Their brief time together had been born of circumstance, not commitment. Still, each day without news made the memory of his promise seem more like a dream than reality. Summer gave way to early autumn, the aspens turning gold against the mountains, when Mr. Miller returned from town with the mail, including a letter addressed to Pearl. Looks like you've got an admirer, he said, handing her the envelope with a kindly smile. Postmarks from Montana. Pearl's hands trembled as she took it, recognizing Adam's bold handwriting immediately. She waited until she was alone in her room before carefully opening it, smoothing the pages with reverent fingers. The letter was dated nearly 3 weeks earlier. Adam wrote of his journey to Montana, the ranch where he was now working, and his hope that she was well. The final paragraph made Pearl's heart race. "I think of you constantly," he'd written, "of your courage, your kindness, and the way the sunlight catches in your hair. I meant what I said, Pearl. Every word. I'll be coming back through Wyoming when we drive the cattle south in October. If you'll see me, I'd like to call on you properly. No bullet wounds or angry card players this time, just a man who can't seem to get a certain remarkable woman out of his mind." Pearl read the letter 3 times before carefully folding it and tucking it beneath her pillow. October. Just a few weeks away. The days seemed to crawl by, each one bringing October and Adam closer. Pearl found herself taking extra care with her appearance, asking Mrs. Miller if she might have Sunday afternoons off to attend church in town, and using her small savings to purchase fabric for a new dress. "Someone special coming to services?" Mrs. Miller asked knowingly as she helped Pearl pin the pattern. Pearl blushed, unable to hide her smile. "Maybe." Mrs. Miller patted her hand. "Good. You deserve some happiness, girl." The first Sunday in October, Pearl wore her new dress to church, her heart pounding as she scanned the congregation for a familiar face. Adam wasn't there, nor was he there the following Sunday. Disappointment settled heavy in her stomach as she walked home alone, wondering if she'd been foolish to hope. On Wednesday, Pearl was hanging laundry when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Shading her eyes, she watched as a rider appeared on the road, his broad-shouldered silhouette immediately familiar even at a distance. Adam. Pearl dropped the wet sheet back into the basket, wiping her hands nervously on her apron as Adam drew closer. He looked different somehow. His hair was shorter, his clothes newer, but his smile when he saw her was exactly as she remembered. He dismounted in one fluid motion, looking far more hale than when she'd last seen him. "Pearl," he said, his voice warm with affection. "You're late," she replied, unable to keep the smile from her face. Adam moved closer, stopping just before her. "The cattle drive took longer than expected. I was beginning to think I'd never get here." Pearl looked up at him, drinking in the sight of his face, the blue of his eyes even more vivid than she'd remembered. "I was beginning to think you weren't coming at all." "I promised I would," Adam said simply. Then, seeming unable to help himself, he reached for her, his hands gently cradling her face. "May I?" Pearl nodded, and his lips found hers in a kiss that felt like coming home after a long journey. When they parted, both breathing a little faster, Adam rested his forehead against hers. "I've missed you," he murmured, "more than I thought possible." Pearl's hands clutched the front of his shirt. "I missed you too." Adam pulled back slightly, his expression growing more serious. "I talked to Mr. Miller in town before coming out here. Asked his permission to court you properly." Pearl's eyes widened. "You did?" Adam nodded. "Seemed like the right thing to do, since you're under his roof." He said yes, by the way. His smile turned slightly sheepish. "Also said if I hurt you, he'd make sure they never found all the pieces." Pearl laughed, the sound surprising even her. "He's protective." "As he should be," Adam agreed, taking her hands in his. "Pearl, I know we haven't known each other long, but these months apart only confirmed what I already suspected. I've never met anyone like you, and I don't want to leave you again." Pearl's heart hammered against her ribs. "What are you saying, Adam?" "I'm saying I've taken a job at the Collins Ranch just outside of town. Foreman position. It comes with a small house." His eyes never left hers, gauging her reaction carefully. "I'm saying I'd like to court you properly, and if you'll have me, make a life with you." Tears filled Pearl's eyes, but for once, they weren't born of fear or pain. "You'd stay here? For me?" Adam's thumb gently brushed away a tear that had escaped. "For us, if that's what you want." "It is," Pearl whispered. "It's what I want more than anything." The smile that broke across Adam's face was like the sun emerging from behind clouds. He lifted her off her feet, spinning her in a circle that made her laugh out loud, the sound carrying across the yard like a declaration. Over the weeks that followed, Adam called on Pearl regularly, always respectful of the Miller's rules and Pearl's reputation. They attended church together on Sundays, took walks along the creek that bordered the Miller property, and slowly, Pearl shared more of her past with him, the good parts, like her father's gentle teachings and her mother's love of music, and the painful ones, like the years with Harold and the scars, both visible and invisible, that she still carried. Adam listened to it all, his anger on her behalf tempered by his respect for the strength it had taken her to survive, to flee, to build a new life for herself. "You're the bravest person I've ever known," he told her one evening as they sat on the porch swing, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against him. Pearl shook her head. "I don't feel brave most of the time." "That's what makes you brave," Adam insisted. "Doing what needs doing even when you're scared." As autumn deepened, bringing the first dusting of snow to the mountain peaks, Adam began work on the house at the Collins Ranch, making improvements and repairs in preparation for the future he hoped to share with Pearl. "It's not much," he told her when he first showed her the small, sturdy cabin. "2 rooms now, but I can add on as needed." Pearl walked through the space, trailing her fingers along the walls Adam had freshly whitewashed, peering out windows he'd repaired, standing in the kitchen he'd equipped with a new cook stove. "It's perfect," she said, turning to find him watching her anxiously. Adam crossed to her, taking her hands in his. "Does that mean you'll consider living here? With me?" Pearl looked up at him, at the man who had shown her what love should be: patient, kind, respectful. "Are you asking me to marry you, Adam Lawson?" "I am," he said, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. "I love you, Pearl. I want to build a life with you if you'll have me." Pearl's heart felt too full for her chest. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'll marry you." The joy on Adam's face was answer enough, but he sealed the promise with a kiss that left them both breathless. They were married on the first Sunday in December, in the small church in town with the Millers standing as witnesses. Pearl wore a dress of deep blue that Mrs. Miller had helped her make, with a sprig of winter berries in her hair. Adam wore his best suit, his eyes never leaving Pearl throughout the ceremony. After, they drove to their new home through gently falling snow, Adam helping Pearl down from the wagon with careful hands. At the threshold, he paused. "Mrs. Lawson," he said, the name still new and wonderful on his lips. "Welcome home." Then he lifted her into his arms, mindful of her dress, and carried her across the threshold into the warm house that smelled of fresh pine and new beginnings. That evening, as they sat down to their first meal as husband and wife, Pearl found herself hesitating as she set the food on the table, old anxieties surfacing despite everything. Adam noticed immediately, rising to take her hands. "Pearl," he said gently, "you never have to be afraid of burning supper or undercooking it or anything else in this house. You'll never be afraid to eat again, not if I have anything to say about it." Pearl looked into his eyes, seeing nothing but sincerity and love reflected back at her. "I know," she said, believing it fully for the first time. "I know." As winter settled over Wyoming, Pearl and Adam settled into their life together. There were adjustments, of course, learning each other's habits and preferences, negotiating the sharing of space and responsibilities. But there was also laughter, warmth, and a deepening bond that made each day better than the last. Pearl began to bake again, something she'd once loved but had abandoned after Harold's criticism became too painful to bear. Adam praised her efforts enthusiastically, especially her apple pies, which quickly became his favorite. In turn, Adam taught Pearl to ride, something she'd never had the opportunity to learn growing up in the city. He was a patient teacher, his hands steady and supportive as she gained confidence in the saddle. "You're a natural," he told her after her first solo ride around the property, her cheeks flushed with cold and excitement. Pearl's smile was radiant. "I had a good teacher." As Christmas approached, they decorated their small home with pine boughs and berries, working side by side in comfortable companionship. Adam surprised Pearl with a small silver locket, inside which he'd placed a lock of his hair. "So I'll always be close to your heart," he said as he fastened it around her neck. Pearl touched it reverently, then gave him his gift, a hand-knitted scarf in shades of blue that matched his eyes. "To keep you warm when you're out with the herd," she explained. Adam wrapped it around his neck immediately, pulling her close for a kiss. "Nothing keeps me warmer than thoughts of coming home to you," he murmured against her lips. They celebrated Christmas Day with the Millers, sharing a feast and exchanging modest gifts. As they drove home through the crisp winter night, stars blazing overhead, Pearl rested her head against Adam's shoulder, contentment spreading through her like the warmth from a hearth. "Happy?" Adam asked, his breath visible in the cold air. "More than I ever thought possible," Pearl replied honestly. January brought bitter cold and heavy snow that kept Adam closer to home than usual, the cattle requiring less attention during the deepest part of winter. They spent evenings by the fire, Adam reading aloud from books they'd borrowed from the Millers while Pearl sewed or knitted, occasionally looking up to find his eyes on her, warm with affection. It was during one of these quiet evenings that Pearl set aside her sewing and took Adam's hand, placing it gently on her still flat stomach. "I have something to tell you," she said softly. Adam's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "Pearl? Are you?" She nodded, happiness and a touch of nervousness mingling in her expression. "The baby should come in August, if my figuring is right." For a moment, Adam sat completely still, his hand warm against her through the fabric of her dress. Then, with a whoop of joy that startled both of them, he swept her into his arms, spinning her in a gentle circle. "A baby," he breathed, setting her carefully back on her feet. "Our baby." Pearl nodded, tears of happiness shining in her eyes. "Our baby." Adam knelt before her, pressing his lips to her stomach through her dress before looking up at her with such naked adoration that it took her breath away. "Thank you," he whispered, "for this life, for our child, for everything." Pearl ran her fingers through his hair, marveling at how far she'd come from the frightened woman who'd fled Tennessee with nothing but bruises and desperate hope. "Thank you for showing me what love should be," she replied. The months that followed were filled with preparation and anticipation. Adam added a small room to their cabin, working through the spring thaw whenever his duties at the ranch allowed. Pearl sewed tiny garments from fabric Mrs. Miller had given her, and slowly, the room filled with all the things their child would need. As Pearl's body changed, Adam's attentiveness only increased. He massaged her aching feet in the evenings, brought her wild strawberries he found while checking fence lines, and held her on the nights when fear crept in, fear that she wouldn't know how to be a good mother, fear that something might go wrong. "You are the strongest person I know," he would tell her, his hand gentle on her swelling belly where their child grew. "And we'll figure it out together." Summer arrived hot and dry, bringing with it the final weeks of Pearl's pregnancy. She moved more slowly now, her body heavy with child, but there was a serenity to her that even the discomforts of late pregnancy couldn't diminish. On an August morning as dawn broke over the mountains, Pearl woke to the first pains of labor. She touched Adam's shoulder gently, rousing him from sleep. "It's time," she said simply. Adam was instantly alert, pressing a kiss to her forehead before moving with the efficiency they'd planned for this moment. He helped Pearl into a comfortable position before riding to fetch Mrs. Miller, who had agreed to help with the birth, and the town doctor if he was needed. The labor was long, the summer heat making it all the more taxing. But Pearl faced it with the same quiet courage she'd shown in all things. Adam remained by her side when she wanted him there, his steady presence anchoring her through the waves of pain. As the sun began to set, painting the small bedroom in hues of gold and amber, Pearl gave a final push, and their daughter entered the world with a lusty cry that brought tears to both her parents' eyes. "She's perfect," Mrs. Miller announced, cleaning the infant before placing her in Pearl's waiting arms. "Absolutely perfect." Adam sat on the edge of the bed, his eyes wide with wonder as he gazed at the tiny face of his daughter. "She looks like you," he said, voice thick with emotion. Pearl smiled tiredly. "She has your eyes, I think. What will you call her, Mrs.?" Miller asked as she bustled about, cleaning up. Pearl and Adam exchanged a look, having discussed names for months. "Hope," Pearl said softly. "Hope Elizabeth Lawson." "A fine name," Mrs. Miller approved. "Now you rest while I get some food into this husband of yours. He looks about ready to fall over." When they were alone, Adam stretched out beside Pearl on the bed, careful not to jostle her, his eyes never leaving their daughter's face. "Thank you," he whispered, pressing a kiss to Pearl's temple. Pearl turned her head to meet his lips properly. "For what?" "For not giving up. For finding your way to Wyoming. For letting me love you." Adam's voice broke slightly on the last words. Pearl leaned her head against his shoulder, their daughter sleeping peacefully between them. "Thank you for showing me I was worth loving," she replied. As night fell over the Wyoming landscape, the small cabin glowed with lamplight and the quiet joy of the family within. Pearl Lawson, once afraid of burning supper, now held her future in her arms, surrounded by the love she'd once thought beyond her reach. And in the years that followed, years that brought 3 more children, a small ranch of their own, and the inevitable challenges and joys of a life fully lived, Pearl never again felt the fear that had once been her constant companion. In its place grew a deep-rooted certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be, loved exactly as she deserved to be loved. On their 25th wedding anniversary, as they sat on the porch of the home they'd built together, watching their grandchildren play in the yard where Hope's children chased the younger ones belonging to their sons, Adam took Pearl's hand, his touch still sending warmth through her after all these years. "Do you remember what I promised you, that day in the Miller's kitchen?" he asked, his voice deeper now, threads of silver running through his still thick hair. Pearl smiled, the years having etched lines of happiness around her eyes and mouth. "You said I'd never have to be afraid again." Adam brought her hand to his lips. "Best promise I ever kept." Pearl leaned against him, content in the knowledge that the frightened woman who had fled Tennessee was now just a distant memory. In her place stood Pearl Lawson, wife, mother, grandmother, beloved. "The only one that matters," she agreed, turning her face up for his kiss as the Wyoming sun set behind them, painting the sky in the same colors of promise that had guided them home all those years ago.